Everyone thinks they know the story of Bruce Lee. The speed, the power, the philosophy, the flawless on-screen fights that looked almost unreal. And everyone thinks they know Bolo Yeung too. The towering physique, the raw strength, the intimidating presence that made him look less like an actor and more like a force of nature. But here's the truth no one talks about. What you see on screen is not always the full story. Behind the bright lights, choreographed movements, and carefully planned camera angles, something else existed. Tension. Not the kind written into a script, but the kind you feel in the air when two powerful personalities occupy the same space. Bruce Lee wasn't just performing martial arts. He was redefining them. Every movement carried meaning. Every strike was controlled, precise, and intentional. To him, martial arts weren't about dominance. They were about discipline, self-awareness, and restraint. Bolo Yeung, on the other hand, represented something very different. His strength was undeniable. His physical presence alone demanded attention. Years of intense training had turned his body into something almost sculpted, solid, and intimidating. When he moved, people noticed. When these two worlds met, it wasn't just a casting decision. It was a collision of philosophies. On set, everything looked professional. The smiles, the rehearsals, the mutual respect shown in front of cameras. But those who were there would later recall moments that felt different. Moments where the energy shifted, where movements felt heavier, where pauses lasted just a fraction too long. No official reports were filed. No dramatic headlines were published. And no behind-the-scenes footage was ever released to confirm anything. Yet the legend survived, passed quietly through conversations, interviews, and subtle hints that never quite crossed into direct claims. Because some moments don't need proof to be felt. This story is not about violence. It's not about proving who is stronger. And it's certainly not about rewriting history. It's about understanding that legends are built not just on what we see, but on what we sense. And sometimes, the most powerful stories are the ones that live between the frames. Unseen, unspoken, and unforgettable. And this is where that story begins. Film sets are designed to look controlled. Every movement planned. Every moment rehearsed. From the outside, it feels safe, predictable, almost mechanical. But anyone who has ever stood on a set knows the truth. When strong personalities collide, no amount of planning can fully control the energy in the room. Bruce Lee carried an intensity that was impossible to fake. Even when he stood still, he radiated focus. He observed everything. The way people moved, the way they reacted, the way they carried themselves. For Bruce, martial arts were not simply techniques. They were expressions of the mind. Every action had purpose, and every purpose required discipline. Bolo Yeung brought something equally powerful, but very different. His presence was physical before it was philosophical. Years of relentless bodybuilding and training had shaped him into a living symbol of strength. When he entered a space, people felt it immediately. Not because he demanded attention, but because his body naturally commanded it. At first, the atmosphere between them appeared respectful, professional, even friendly. Both men understood the camera, the choreography, and the responsibility that came with being on screen. But beneath that surface, something subtle began to form. Not hostility, but awareness. Awareness of capability. When rehearsals began, the difference in their approaches became clear. Bruce focused on precision, timing, and control. Each movement was deliberate, almost meditative. Bolo's movements, by contrast, were grounded in raw power. Solid, heavy. Every step carried weight. Neither approach was wrong, but they were different. And difference, when left unspoken, creates tension. Small moments started to stand out. A grip held just a little longer than expected. A block that landed with more force than rehearsed. Nothing dangerous. Nothing dramatic. Just enough to be noticed, especially by two men who understood physical language better than most people understand words. Crew members later described the atmosphere as quietly intense. Not chaotic. Not aggressive. Just focused to the point of discomfort. Conversations lowered. Eyes watched more closely. Movements became sharper. Bruce Lee was known for control above all else. He believed true mastery was shown not in how hard you strike, but in how precisely you can stop. To him, restraint was the highest form of power. Bolo Yeung, equally disciplined in his own way, was known for pushing physical limits, testing strength, endurance, and presence. In that shared space, neither man needed to say anything. Their bodies communicated for them. There was no outburst, no dramatic confrontation, no moment that could be pointed to and labeled as a fight. And that's exactly why this story endured. Because tension doesn't always explode. Sometimes it compresses. Studios rarely talk about moments like these. Not because they're dangerous, but because they don't fit the narrative. Audiences want clean stories, clear heroes, clear outcomes. But reality is rarely that simple. What existed between Bruce Lee and Bolo Yeung in those moments wasn't rivalry. It wasn't conflict. It was something more human. Two highly trained individuals silently measuring space, energy, and respect. And sometimes that silent exchange is more powerful than any choreographed scene ever filmed. By the end of those days on set, something had shifted, not publicly, not officially, but subtly. The kind of shift you feel rather than see. And in legends, those shifts matter. Rehearsals are meant to feel routine. Familiar movements. Repeated patterns. The same sequences run again and again until they become automatic. On paper, this day was no different from any other. The schedule was clear. The choreography was known. The crew expected another controlled, professional session. But something felt different from the very beginning. Bruce Lee arrived early, as he often did. Calm, focused, centered. He warmed up quietly, moving through his motions with precision, his breathing steady and controlled. To Bruce, preparation wasn't just physical, it was mental. He treated every rehearsal as if it mattered, because to him, it always did. Bolo Yeung arrived not long after. His presence changed the room instantly. Not through words, but through mass. Through gravity. He moved with the confidence of someone who trusted his body completely. Years of training had taught him how far he could push and where his limits lived. The first few takes unfolded smoothly. Movements flowed as rehearsed. Strikes stopped exactly where they were supposed to. Blocks landed clean. On the surface, everything was working. Then came a moment no one planned for. A transition, brief, almost invisible to an untrained eye. A grip during a movement lasted just a fraction longer than expected. Not enough to cause pain. Not enough to break form. But enough to be noticed. Bruce felt it immediately. He adjusted without reacting. That was his nature. His control wasn't passive. It was active, intentional. He compensated, flowed through the motion, and finished the sequence without interruption. To anyone watching casually, nothing had happened. But something had changed. On the next run-through, movements became sharper. Timing tightened. Distances shortened slightly. Not recklessly, precisely. It was as if both men were unconsciously testing boundaries, not with force, but with awareness. The room grew quieter. Crew members leaned in. Conversations faded. No one said anything, but everyone felt it. The energy had shifted from rehearsal to something closer to examination. Not conflict, not competition, a mutual recognition of capability. Bruce believed that true understanding came from experience, not explanation. Bolo believed in testing strength honestly. Neither philosophy required words. Another exchange, another movement. A block met resistance that felt heavier than before. A counter stopped closer to its target. Still controlled, still professional, but undeniably more real. This wasn't anger. It wasn't ego. It was instinct. Highly trained individuals don't need escalation to recognize seriousness. They feel in pressure, in balance, in the way force is redirected rather than released. At one point, the director called for a pause, not because something went wrong, but because something felt intense. Water was offered. Adjustments were discussed. Smiles appeared. The professionalism never broke. Yet beneath that surface calm, something had been established. Bruce Lee was known for his ability to stop, to pull back at the exact moment before harm. Bolo Yeung was known for his ability to endure, to absorb force without flinching. In that brief window, those qualities met. No blows were exchanged. No lines were crossed. But the message was clear. From that moment on, the movements returned to their scripted precision, but with a new layer of respect. Every action was measured. Every distance carefully maintained. The earlier looseness was gone, replaced by sharp awareness. This is how moments become legends. Not through spectacle, but through silence. Because when two people who understand physical power recognize each other's limits without exceeding them, something rare happens. Mutual acknowledgement. There was no footage labeled the incident. No dramatic retelling on talk shows. No official confirmation. And yet, decades later, people still talk about it. Not because it was violent, but because it was restrained. And restraint, in a world of true mastery, is the loudest statement of all. After the rehearsal ended, nothing dramatic happened. No raised voices. No confrontations. No urgent meetings behind closed doors. And yet, the atmosphere had changed. Film sets are loud places by nature. Instructions being called out, equipment moving, conversations overlapping. But that day, the noise returned more slowly than usual. People went back to their tasks, but with a subtle awareness, as if everyone had collectively agreed not to mention what they had just felt. Bruce Lee wiped his hands, took a sip of water, and moved with the same calm confidence he always carried. There was no visible tension in his posture, no sign of agitation. If anything, he appeared even more composed than before. That was his strength, not reaction, but control. Bolo Yeung adjusted his stance, stretched quietly, and nodded to the crew. His expression revealed nothing out of the ordinary. To anyone who didn't know what to look for, it was just another professional reset between takes. And that was the point. Nothing had crossed a line, but something had been acknowledged. The director called the next setup. The camera rolled. The choreography resumed. And on the surface, everything looked exactly as it should. Clean, precise, controlled. But underneath the movements, there was a new layer of caution, a shared understanding that hadn't existed before. Neither man needed to speak. Among disciplined individuals, silence is often the clearest form of communication. Crew members later described the remainder of the day as different, but not uncomfortable. There was no fear, no sense of danger, just heightened awareness. The kind that comes when everyone knows they've witnessed something subtle but meaningful. Studios are built on images, on consistency, on protecting narratives. Moments like this don't fit neatly into press releases or interviews. They aren't scandals. They aren't stories of triumph or failure. They exist in a gray area, and gray areas are often ignored. Not because they're unimportant, but because they're complicated. Bruce Lee rarely spoke about moments that didn't need explanation. He believed that truth revealed itself through action, not commentary. Bolo Yeung, equally reserved, never sought to dramatize behind-the-scenes experiences. Both men understood something crucial. That respect is not declared, it's demonstrated. In the days that followed, there were no changes to schedules, no replacements, no adjustments beyond the usual refinements of filmmaking. Everything continued as planned. And yet people noticed something. The spacing between movements was more exact. The timing slightly more deliberate. The control unmistakable. It wasn't fear, it was precision. The kind that comes from mutual awareness, not hesitation. This is how real moments disappear into history. They don't explode into headlines. They don't leave scars or records. They fade quietly, carried only by those who were present. Over time, the silence around that day became part of the story, not through rumors or exaggeration, but through the absence of denial, through carefully chosen words in later interviews, through respectful pauses when questions came too close. Sometimes, what isn't said is more revealing than what is. The legend didn't grow because of what happened. It grew because of how everyone moved forward afterward. No one needed to prove anything. No one needed to revisit the moment. The understanding was complete, and that is why, Decades later, people still ask about it. Not because they expect a dramatic answer, but because they sense that something real once passed between two masters and was quietly honored by being left alone. This wasn't avoidance. It was respect. And in a world obsessed with spectacle, that choice made the moment unforgettable. To understand what truly mattered in that moment, you have to understand Bruce Lee. Not the icon, not the movie star, but the thinker behind the movement. Bruce never believed that power was something to be displayed for approval. To him, strength meant awareness, control, the ability to act, and the discipline to stop. He often spoke about the illusion of dominance, about how the loudest force is rarely the most effective one. In Bruce Lee's philosophy, restraint was not weakness. It was mastery. He believed that the ultimate expression of skill was not how hard you could strike, but how precisely you could choose not to. Anyone could lose control. Few could hold it. That belief shaped everything he did, on screen and off. When Bruce trained, he wasn't just building speed or muscle. He was refining intention. Every movement had to serve a purpose. Every action had to align with awareness. This is why his presence felt so intense. He wasn't performing. He was present. So when that unspoken moment occurred, it didn't require a reaction. There was no need to escalate because escalation would have contradicted everything he stood for. Instead, Bruce did what he always did. He adjusted, centered himself, and allowed the moment to pass without resistance. That decision was not accidental. It was a message, not spoken aloud, not explained, but unmistakable to anyone who understood the language of discipline. By choosing restraint, Bruce demonstrated confidence without confrontation. He didn't need to prove anything, because proof was unnecessary. True mastery doesn't announce itself, it's recognized. This approach wasn't unique to that day. Throughout his life, Bruce avoided unnecessary conflict. He challenged ideas, not people. He believed growth came from understanding, not from domination. Bolo Yeung, a disciplined professional in his own right, understood this immediately. Strength recognizes strength. Control recognizes control. In that shared awareness, there was no winner or loser, only mutual acknowledgement. This is what separates legends from performers. A performer seeks applause. A legend leaves an impression. Bruce Lee's legacy was never built on spectacle alone. It was built on meaning, on the idea that martial arts were not about violence, but about self-expression and self-mastery. The body was a tool. The mind was the guide. That moment on set reflected this philosophy perfectly. It wasn't dramatic because it didn't need to be. It didn't escalate because escalation wasn't the point. The message had already been delivered, and that message echoed long after the cameras stopped rolling. People who worked with Bruce often described him as calm under pressure, focused, grounded. He carried himself with quiet certainty, the kind that doesn't demand attention but naturally receives it. This is why the story survived without details. Why it didn't need confirmation. Why it still resonates. Because it aligns perfectly with who Bruce Lee was. In a world that often confuses aggression with strength, Bruce offered a different definition. Strength was clarity. Strength was restraint. Strength was knowing exactly how much power you had and choosing when not to use it. That was the real lesson. Not about who could overpower whom. Not about dominance or rivalry, but about discipline, awareness, and respect. And in that quiet choice to remain composed, Bruce Lee left behind something more powerful than any scene ever filmed. A reminder that true mastery is silent. To understand why this moment was never officially acknowledged, you have to understand how legends are protected. Not by secrecy, but by silence. Film studios don't just produce movies. They produce images, carefully constructed narratives that must remain consistent in the public eye. Audiences want clarity, heroes and villains, scripted fights, controlled outcomes. What they don't want is ambiguity, especially when it doesn't fit a marketable story. The moment that unfolded between Bruce Lee and Bolo Yeung didn't break any rules. It didn't cause disruption. It didn't require damage control. But it did something far more inconvenient. It existed in a gray area. and gray areas don't sell. There was nothing to report. No incident. No conflict. No official statement needed. And without those elements, there was no story that could be safely framed for the public. Studios don't amplify moments that can't be neatly explained. They quietly move past them. Bruce Lee's public image was carefully balanced. He was presented as disciplined, philosophical, controlled, a symbol of martial arts as art rather than aggression. Any narrative suggesting behind-the-scenes intensity, even if respectful and restrained, risked being misunderstood. Not because it was dangerous, but because it was nuanced. Nuance doesn't survive headlines. Bolo Yeung, likewise, was known for his professionalism and physical presence. Reducing a complex, unspoken moment to speculation would have served no one. Both men had reputations built on respect. Neither had anything to gain from turning silence into spectacle. And so, nothing was said, not out of fear, not out of denial, but out of understanding. This is how many real moments disappear. Not erased, just unspoken. Over time, the absence of commentary becomes part of the story itself. People sense there's more, but no one fills in the blanks. Later interviews offered clues, never statements. Carefully chosen words. Thoughtful pauses. Answers that redirected rather than denied. Not because there was something to hide, but because there was nothing that needed explaining. Silence, in this case, was preservation. It preserved Bruce Lee's philosophy. It preserved Bolo Yeung's professionalism. And it preserved the dignity of a moment that didn't need interpretation. In the world of film, stories are shaped long before they reach the audience. What gets shared is intentional. What stays behind the curtain often stays there because it lacks a clear angle, not because it lacks truth. This wasn't a secret being buried. It was a moment being respected. Decades later, fans began revisiting old footage, slowing down scenes, analyzing expressions, reading between frames, not to prove anything, but to understand the energy they felt. Because sometimes, viewers can sense authenticity even when it isn't labeled. That's how legends evolve, not through official releases, but through quiet curiosity passed from one generation to the next. The reason this moment was never publicized isn't because it was explosive, it's because it was subtle. It didn't challenge authority. It didn't demand attention. It simply existed and then passed. And that may be why it continues to fascinate. In an era where everything is documented, shared, and dissected, the idea of something meaningful happening without explanation feels rare, almost uncomfortable. But that discomfort is what gives the story its power, because it reminds us that not everything important leaves a paper trail. Some moments are remembered not because they were shown, but because they were felt. And that quiet preservation is what allowed the legend to remain intact, while still leaving room for wonder. In the end, the question was never about who was stronger. That's the trap many people fall into when they hear stories like this. They look for a winner. They want a final verdict, a clear outcome they can debate, defend, or argue against. But that was never the point. What truly lasted from that quiet moment wasn't force, it was understanding. Bruce Lee didn't build his legacy by overpowering others. He built it by redefining what strength meant. To him, power without awareness was empty. Skill without control was incomplete. And respect, once earned, didn't need to be spoken aloud. That brief, unspoken exchange reflected everything he believed. It showed that mastery isn't loud. That confidence doesn't need confrontation. That discipline reveals itself in restraint. Bolo Yeung, equally disciplined in his own path, played his role in that moment without escalation. There was no ego-driven response, no attempt to dominate or challenge, just professionalism and recognition. And that mutual understanding is why the story survived. Not as a rumor, not as controversy, but as a quiet legend. Over time, Bruce Lee became more than a martial artist or actor. He became a symbol of adaptability, self-expression, and inner control. His words were studied, his movements analyzed, his philosophy applied far beyond combat, into business, art, and life itself. Moments like this one didn't contradict that legacy, they confirmed it. Because real character isn't revealed when things go wrong. It's revealed when things could go wrong and don't. The reason people still talk about this moment isn't because they believe something violent happened. It's because they sense authenticity, a rare instance where reality aligned perfectly with philosophy. No cameras needed to capture it. No statements needed to explain it. The message was already complete. In a world obsessed with spectacle, this story stands out precisely because it lacks one. There's no dramatic footage to replay. No headline to quote. Just a shared understanding that something meaningful once passed between two masters and was left untouched. That restraint is what gave the moment weight. And that weight carried forward. Every time someone studies Bruce Lee's teachings about control, adaptability, and awareness, they unknowingly revisit moments like this. Moments where strength was measured not by impact, but by intention. This is why the story refuses to fade. It reminds us that true power doesn't need validation. That respect doesn't require an audience. And that legacy is shaped as much by what we choose not to do as by what we do. So when people ask, was it real? The better question is, does it matter? Because the truth that endures isn't about a fight. It's about philosophy, about restraint, about the quiet confidence that defines real mastery. And that is why, even without footage, even without confirmation, this story continues to resonate. Not as a spectacle, but as a lesson that Bruce Lee lived and left behind for the world to understand.